Before the world knew her name, before headlines screamed words like monster, evil, or America's first female serial killer, Aileen Wuornos was simply a child. A forgotten child. A child the world turned its back on long before she ever picked up a gun. If you want to understand how a little girl became a killer, you have to start here, at the very beginning, where the darkness was already waiting for her. Aileen Carol Pittman entered this world on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, under the kind of circumstances that almost seemed to preordain her tragic future. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted sex offender, diagnosed schizophrenic, and abusive beyond comprehension. He abandoned his family before Aileen was even born, vanishing from her life but leaving behind a legacy of shame and violence. While Aileen was still just a baby, her father hung himself in prison. He never saw her face. She never knew his voice. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, wasn't prepared for motherhood. Barely 16 years old, terrified, overwhelmed, and already saddled with another child, she did what many frightened, broken teenagers have done before her. She ran. Aileen and her brother, Keith, were left behind like forgotten baggage, handed off to grandparents who were ill-equipped to raise them. This would be the first of many abandonments Aileen would suffer in her life, but far from the last. The children were taken in by Lori and Britta Wuornos, their grandparents on their mother's side. On paper it seemed like a chance at stability. In reality it was simply a different kind of hell. Lori was a violent alcoholic, prone to fits of rage, beatings, and humiliation. Britta, equally lost to her own demons, found comfort at the bottom of a bottle. Their household wasn't a home. It was a battleground. Love did not live there. Warmth did not visit. From the moment she could understand the world around her, Aileen learned this truth: survival would come at a cost. Her childhood was not marked by dolls, bedtime stories, or birthday parties. It was marked by black eyes, silent tears, and empty cupboards. Aileen became familiar with hunger before she became familiar with kindness. She learned to hide bruises, to avoid eye contact, to disappear into corners. No one protected her. No one hugged her. No one cared. Her grandfather's violent outbursts were not reserved for adults. He took his anger out on Aileen and Keith, sometimes with his fists, sometimes with whatever object was closest. Aileen quickly understood that crying only made it worse. Her grandmother, trapped in her own haze of alcohol, either didn't notice or didn't care. And so, Aileen learned another lesson early on: the people who are supposed to love you, won't. At school things were no better. Bullied relentlessly, mocked for her poverty, ridiculed for her unkempt appearance, Aileen stood on the outside of every circle. Other children sensed her vulnerability like blood in water. The taunts were cruel, the isolation complete. Teachers ignored her, writing her off as another problem kid destined for failure. There was no safe space, no escape. By the age of 11, Aileen's desperation began to manifest in ways that even adults would struggle to comprehend. She started exchanging sexual favors for cigarettes, food, or the promise of a warm place to sleep. These were not choices made with agency. They were acts of survival. Small acts, yes, but acts rooted in a brutal reality. Her body was the only thing anyone seemed to value. The men who used her didn't see a child. They saw an object. Someone disposable. Someone whose tears didn't matter. Some of them were strangers. Some of them were friends of her grandfather. Abuse became routine. Protection never came. Silence was her only shield. No one helped. No one stopped them. No one saved her. At 14, Aileen's body bore the consequence of her abuse. She became pregnant. The father? Unknown. Speculation pointed to one of the many men who had taken advantage of her, but no name was ever confirmed. She was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, out of sight, out of mind. Alone, terrified, and numb, she gave birth to a baby boy she would never hold, never name, never know. The child was immediately placed for adoption, erased from her life like she had been erased from so many others. When she returned to her grandparents' house, there was no forgiveness, no understanding, no fresh start. Only more violence. More blame. More humiliation. Her grandfather finally kicked her out for good, hurling her into the Michigan winter with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Homeless at 15. Alone in the woods. Sleeping in abandoned cars. Selling herself beside lonely highways just to eat. This wasn't a life. This was survival at its rawest, ugliest form. She learned to build fires to keep warm. She learned which gas stations wouldn't chase her off. She learned which men were dangerous and which ones were just desperate. But they all took something. And she gave it because there was no choice. Over time, the streets became her education. She learned not to trust kindness because it always came with a price. She learned that violence wasn't random, it was inevitable. And slowly a belief took root inside her. If she didn't strike first, she wouldn't survive at all. This mindset would later fuel her rage, justify her actions, and harden her heart beyond repair. Her brother Keith, her only tether to family, remained her one fragile connection to the past. But even that thread was cut when Keith died of cancer. The grief wasn't just for his death. It was for the final confirmation that she truly was alone. There was no one left. Not a single soul on earth who cared whether she lived or died. By her early 20s, Aileen's rap sheet was growing longer. Theft, assault, weapons charges, prostitution, disorderly conduct. Jail cells replaced bedrooms. Courtrooms replaced classrooms. Every mugshot captured her descent, from a frightened girl into a hardened, furious woman who had learned that the world would not give her anything unless she took it. Florida became her refuge not because it offered hope, but because it offered highways full of lonely men with cash in hand. Daytona Beach, Port Orange, the endless stretches of I-75, these became her hunting grounds. She roamed from bar to motel to truck stop, a ghost in the system, unnoticed unless she caused trouble. And trouble was never far behind. In 1986 she met Tyria Moore. A hotel maid from Ohio, quiet, reserved, seemingly everything Aileen wasn't. Their relationship offered Aileen her first glimpse of something resembling stability. Tyria didn't judge her past. She didn't flinch at Aileen's scars. For the first time in years, Aileen felt seen, felt needed, felt loved, or something close enough to keep her hanging on. But love, in Aileen's world, wasn't enough to erase the hunger, the poverty, the desperation. She needed money. She needed security. She needed to keep Tyria. And to do that, she returned to what she knew: men, highways, survival at any cost. These years on the streets didn't just break Aileen, they remade her. She wasn't the frightened little girl anymore. She was a fighter, a survivor. And in her mind, the world owed her something. The men who used her owed her something. Pain, fear, revenge. Her transformation wasn't complete yet, but the foundation had been set. From a childhood drowned in violence, to an adolescence soaked in survival, Aileen Wuornos was no longer just a victim. She was a storm-gathering force. And soon that storm would break loose, with blood. By the late 1970s, Aileen Wuornos had become a permanent shadow drifting across the highways and backroads of America. From Michigan to Colorado, from Georgia to Florida, she floated without roots, without a plan, and without hope. Homeless, penniless, and discarded by society, she existed in the margins. A woman no one wanted to see, living a life no one wanted to acknowledge. The streets didn't just shape Aileen. They hardened her. They trained her. They prepared her for the violence she would one day unleash. Her survival strategy was both simple and brutal: sell sex to stay alive. Truck stops, gas stations, dingy roadside bars, and seedy motels became her office. Aileen became part of an invisible workforce of women trading their bodies for the barest necessities: a sandwich, a tank of gas, a bed for the night. The exchange was rarely safe and never dignified. Every man she approached was a potential danger wrapped in the promise of $20. She wasn't alone in this lifestyle. Countless other women were trapped in the same cycle of desperation. But even among them, Aileen stood out. Her anger burned hotter. Her wounds ran deeper. Other women tried to band together for protection. Aileen didn't trust anyone. Not women. Not men. Not the police. Not God. She had been betrayed too many times to believe in anything other than herself. Life on the streets taught her harsh lessons. Kindness was often a prelude to cruelty. A smile could hide a knife. A handshake might lead to a punch. A ride offered on a lonely road might end in rape. She learned to sleep with one eye open, to hide money in her shoes, to scan every room for exits. She carried weapons, knives, guns, whatever she could get her hands on, and wasn't afraid to use them. Violence became as routine as breathing. Her body bore the marks of her lifestyle. Scars from beatings. Teeth knocked out in fights. Bruises from strangers. Cigarette burns left by sadistic Johns. Every scar told a story she stopped bothering to repeat because no one listened. Police viewed her as a nuisance at best, a criminal at worst. She cycled in and out of jails across the country. Theft, assault, drunk and disorderly, prostitution, weapons charges. Each arrest was another nail in the coffin of any future she might have imagined. Yet amid this chaos, there were moments of stillness. Sleeping under bridges, watching dawn break across an empty highway. Sitting alone at a diner counter with a stolen cup of coffee. These were the rare moments Aileen felt human, fleeting reminders that she was still alive, still here, still fighting. But they weren't enough to soften her anger. If anything, they sharpened it. Why did the world spit on people like her? Why did men treat her like trash? Why did no one care? Florida became her final destination, not by design but by necessity. The warmth suited her. The highways offered endless streams of lonely men looking for company. Daytona Beach, Port Orange, and the endless sprawl of Interstate 75 became her hunting grounds. She haunted truck stops and biker bars, targeting men who wanted quick, anonymous sex. These men didn't ask questions. They didn't care about her past. They just wanted what they paid for. Sometimes they paid in money. Sometimes they paid in pain. During these years, Aileen refined her survival tactics. She learned how to read a man's intentions by the way he gripped the steering wheel, by how he glanced at her legs, by the tightness in his jaw. She learned to sense danger before it erupted. Sometimes she fought back. Sometimes she ran. Sometimes she took the first swing. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Hesitation could get her killed. Her drinking worsened. Cheap vodka became her companion. It dulled the fear, numbed the anger, softened the memories of a childhood she couldn't escape. Drunk, she was louder, bolder, quicker to violence. Sober, she was haunted, fragile, lost in thoughts she didn't want to speak aloud. But drunk or sober, the rage remained constant, a steady drumbeat beneath her skin. It was during this period that Aileen's hatred toward men solidified into something poisonous and permanent. Every assault reinforced her belief that men were predators and she was prey. But she didn't want to be prey anymore. If survival meant striking first, then so be it. If men wanted violence, she would give it back tenfold. Not just for herself. For every woman who had ever been used, discarded, or broken. This mindset grew with each brutal encounter. A man pulling a knife didn't scare her. A man threatening to kill her only made her laugh. She'd been to hell already. Death wasn't the worst thing waiting for her. Living without dignity, without safety, without love, that was worse. And so, Aileen became more aggressive, more unpredictable. Some men walked away from her bloodied. Some never made it out of the motel room. Her relationship with Tyria Moore, which began in 1986, offered a strange kind of stability. Tyria was quiet, reserved, the opposite of Aileen in every way. Yet they clung to each other with desperate intensity. Aileen supported them through her sex work, and for a time Tyria turned a blind eye to the bruises and the rage. Their relationship wasn't healthy. It was codependent, volatile, and fueled by alcohol and fear. But to Aileen it felt like love. And love was something worth fighting for, or killing for. As their finances worsened, Aileen's desperation deepened. Her encounters with men grew riskier. Her actions more violent. In her mind, every man was a threat, every encounter a potential fight for her life. The line between self-defense and premeditation blurred. She began carrying a .22 caliber pistol just in case. The streets had taught her, better to shoot first and live another day. By the end of the 1980s, Aileen Wuornos was a woman on the edge. Homeless, drunk, violent, and seething with a lifetime of rage, she roamed Florida's highways looking for the next man foolish enough to pick her up. Her crimes hadn't escalated to murder yet, but the path was clear. She was moving toward it step by step, drink by drink, punch by punch. Each night she sold her body reinforced her hatred. Each violent John cemented her belief that men deserved whatever pain she could inflict. Each scar reminded her that mercy was weakness. And soon, when push came to shove, she would stop selling her body and start taking lives. The streets hadn't just shaped Aileen Wuornos. They had built her into a weapon, one forged in abandonment, sharpened by abuse, and ready to strike without warning. The first shot hadn't been fired yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it would mark the birth of America's most infamous female serial killer. By the year 1989, the Florida highways had become more than just a place for Aileen Wuornos to hustle a few dollars from lonely men. They had transformed into her battleground, a vast stretch of asphalt where she tested the boundaries of fear, power, and survival. Night after night, she roamed those roads armed not just with desperation, but with something far more dangerous. A boiling hatred that had been simmering inside her for decades. All it needed was a spark. And that spark came in the form of a man named Richard Mallory. Aileen had met hundreds of men by then. She could read them like a map, the ones who were kind, the ones who were cruel, and the ones who thought paying for sex gave them permission to treat her like garbage. Mallory was different, though not in any way that mattered to the world. To the world, he was just another man looking for a quick thrill on a lonely highway. But to Aileen, he would become the beginning of her end, and the first name on a list that would turn her from victim to murderer. November 30, 1989. Aileen was hitchhiking near Daytona Beach when Mallory pulled over. He wasn't a stranger to danger himself, a 51-year-old electronics store owner with a history of mental health issues and a criminal past. The night unfolded like so many others had before. Small talk, an offer of money, the promise of sex exchanged for cash. They drove into the woods together, secluded from the world, isolated in the dark. What happened next has been debated, argued, and dissected for years. Aileen's version was simple. He tried to rape her and she fought back. In her mind, it wasn't murder. It was survival. When Mallory turned violent, she claimed she pulled her pistol and fired. What? Twice? Again and again until the fear in her veins was replaced by something else entirely. Relief. Power. Control. She dragged his body deeper into the woods, took his cash, his car, his belongings. Then she vanished back into the Florida night as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something monumental. For the first time in her life, Aileen Wuornos hadn't been the victim. She had been the one holding the weapon. She had decided who lived and who died. And that feeling, the cold, electric surge of dominance, lodged itself deep within her. Killing Mallory didn't haunt her. It emboldened her. When police found Mallory's abandoned vehicle and his bullet-riddled body days later, they had no leads, no witnesses, no motive. Just another dead man on a desolate stretch of road. Florida was no stranger to such things. The case barely made the news. Aileen slipped through unnoticed, unseen, a ghost in a denim jacket and scuffed boots. Back at the seedy motel she shared with Tyria Moore, Aileen acted as if nothing had changed. She brought home stolen items, flashed new cash, bought beers for strangers at bars. Tyria asked questions, of course. Where had the money come from? Whose car was that? Aileen brushed them off with half-truths and jokes. In Tyria's eyes, Aileen was just hustling harder, doing what she'd always done to keep them afloat. The truth, that Aileen had killed a man, hung between them unspoken, a shadow growing thicker by the day. But it wouldn't stop at one. The hunger had been awakened. Over the next 12 months, Aileen's pattern became chillingly clear. She stuck to the highways, chose men who wouldn't be missed right away, middle-aged, alone, looking for company. Each encounter followed the same script. Lure them with the promise of sex, isolate them in the woods, and when the fear crept in, when the rage bubbled over, she pulled the trigger. Sometimes 6 shots. Sometimes 9. Always enough to make sure they didn't get back up. Victim after victim fell. David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio. Each man marked another step in Aileen's descent. She took their cars, their money, their belongings, and left their bodies to rot under the Florida sun. These weren't calculated kills. They weren't about profit or methodical planning. They were about power. About striking first. About making sure no man would ever hurt her again. With each murder, her paranoia deepened. She felt eyes on her everywhere. Cops, strangers, even Tyria. The streets whispered rumors about a woman on the run, a killer in their midst. Aileen drank more, fought more, unraveled faster. Her face, once just another weathered fixture in biker bars and truck stops, became burned into the memories of witnesses and law enforcement alike. Still, Tyria stayed. Whether out of love, fear, or dependency, she remained by Aileen's side through it all. Their relationship twisted into something toxic and desperate. They fought constantly, broke furniture, hurled accusations, and made up with trembling apologies. Tyria depended on Aileen's money. Aileen depended on Tyria's silent loyalty. It was a fragile ecosystem teetering on collapse. And then came the mistake. Peter Seams' car. After killing Seams, Aileen kept his vehicle and took Tyria for a joyride up north. But Aileen was drunk, reckless, and careless. She crashed the car and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints, bloodstains, and a trail straight back to Florida. It was only a matter of time before detectives connected the dots. The missing men, the stolen cars, the witnesses who described a blonde, angry woman with a short fuse and a .22 caliber pistol. The noose was tightening. Aileen could feel it. Her nights became restless. Her paranoia turned manic. Every man she met, every glance from a stranger felt like a threat. She clutched her gun like a lifeline, ready to kill at the slightest provocation. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was hunting. And in her mind it was all justified. Every shot fired was one less man who could hurt her, one less predator in a world full of wolves. By now, Aileen had convinced herself that murder wasn't evil. It was necessary. It was survival. It was vengeance. But beneath that rationale, something darker stirred. Thrill. Satisfaction. Control. The power to decide who lived and died filled a void inside her that no man, no drink, no woman ever could. The newspapers began catching on. The damsel of death. Highway hooker killer. America's first female serial killer. Eileen's face splashed across headlines alongside police sketches and desperate pleas for information. Still, she remained a step ahead, slipping through the cracks like smoke, hiding in cheap motels and dive bars, blending in with the shadows she'd always called home. But Tyria was cracking. The fear ate at her. She wanted out. She wanted normalcy. And when the police finally came knocking, she made her choice. She betrayed Aileen. In a sting operation, Tyria lured Aileen to a bar under the pretense of reconciliation. Surveillance teams watched as Aileen drank herself numb, unaware she was walking into a trap. Days later, she was arrested at a bar called The Last Resort, fitting given how far she had fallen. In interrogation rooms, detectives played a dangerous game of manipulation. They used Tyria's fear, her tears, her pleas as leverage. Aileen, faced with the reality that the only person she trusted had turned against her, broke. She confessed. Not out of remorse. Not out of guilt. But to protect Tyria. To spare her from prosecution. It was the final twisted act of love in a life defined by betrayal. Eileen's transformation was complete. From abused child to hardened prostitute, from victim to predator, from woman to murderer. The highways had been her hunting ground, but now the courtroom would become her stage. And the world at last would hear her story, though whether they believed her version of it was another matter entirely. Her reign of terror was over. But her legacy, that was just beginning. Florida's highways have always carried a sense of quiet danger. Long stretches of cracked asphalt slicing through empty woods, dotted with lonely truck stops, seedy motels and tired gas stations. In these forgotten spaces between cities, Aileen Wuornos hunted. By the dawn of 1990, she wasn't just drifting anymore, she was predating. The highways became her jungle. The men who stopped for her became prey. And each mile marker blurred into the next, stitched together by blood and bullets. Her first victim, Richard Mallory, wasn't an accident. At least not to Aileen. She may have told herself, and the police later, that it was self-defense. That Mallory had tried to rape her. That she had no choice. But the truth was more complicated. Somewhere between survival and satisfaction, between terror and power, Aileen discovered something she had never truly felt before: control. For a woman who had been brutalized her entire life, who had been used, thrown away, beaten down, that feeling was intoxicating. And it didn't end with Mallory. Just 6 months later, another man would vanish. Another life would end. Another highway would claim another victim. David Spears. On June 1, 1990, 47-year-old David Spears set out for work and never returned. A construction worker from Winter Garden, Florida, Spears was the kind of man who wouldn't raise suspicion. Hardworking, quiet, reliable. But when police found his truck abandoned along State Road 19, something was wrong. A few days later, his naked body turned up miles away in the woods. 6 bullet wounds riddled his torso. The brutality was unmistakable. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't panic. This was execution. Charles Carskadden. Less than 3 weeks later, Charles Carskadden, 40 years old, would meet the same fate. A part-time rodeo worker from Missouri, Carskadden was passing through Florida when he picked up a hitchhiker. He might have thought he was doing her a favor. Or maybe he was looking for company like so many men before him. Either way, on June 6, 1990, his body was found in Pasco County. Shot 9 times with a .22 caliber pistol. The same gun Aileen used to kill Richard Mallory. Police noted the excessive violence. 9 bullets. Not fear. Fury. Peter Seams. In July 1990, Eileen's spree crossed the threshold. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, disappeared en route to New Jersey. His car, a Pontiac Sunbird, would later be found abandoned, crashed, and smeared with fingerprints belonging to Aileen Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore. But Seams' body was never recovered. In Eileen's mind, without a body there was no crime. She was getting bolder. Sloppier. More reckless. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was playing a dangerous game. One she thought she could win. Troy Burress. On July 31, 1990, Troy Burress, a 50-year-old sausage salesman, vanished while out on his delivery route. Weeks passed before his body surfaced in a wooded area in Marion County. Again, bullet wounds told the story police already suspected. Again, a man alone on a highway had picked up the wrong woman. Eileen's pattern had become chillingly clear. Men in cars, isolated locations, sudden violence. Each kill felt more deliberate, more calculated. Dick Humphreys. By September, Eileen's spree had accelerated. Dick Humphreys, 56, was a retired Air Force major, a former police chief, and working as a child abuse investigator. If anyone should have known the risks of picking up strangers, it was him. Yet on September 11, 1990, Humphreys disappeared. Days later, his body was found in Marion County, shot 7 times in the head and torso. His car was missing. His badge lay abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A man who fought to protect others had been felled by the very violence he worked against. Walter Antonio. Walter Antonio would be her last known victim. A 62-year-old trucker and reserve police officer, Antonio's body was found on November 19, 1990, fully clothed, shot 4 times, dumped near a logging road in Dixie County. His car was later discovered in a different county altogether. By now, law enforcement knew they weren't looking at isolated incidents. This was a serial killer. A female serial killer. The rarity of it stunned investigators. The brutality horrified them. And the growing mountain of evidence pointed in one direction: Aileen Wuornos. A pattern of power. What linked these men wasn't just their deaths or the bullets or the highways. It was Eileen's method. She lured them with the promise of sex, gained their trust just long enough to get them alone, then struck with lethal efficiency. To the world, these men were random. To Aileen, they were all the same. Predators. Liars. Users. Abusers. Every shot fired wasn't just at the man in front of her. It was at every man who had ever hurt her. Each kill brought her something different. At first it was relief. Relief that she wasn't the victim. Relief that she had survived another night. But soon relief gave way to something darker: thrill. The rush of holding life and death in her hands. The power of watching fear bloom in a man's eyes and knowing she was its cause. The satisfaction of taking what she wanted: money, cars, control, without apology. Her crimes escalated because they fed something inside her that had been starving for decades. Not just rage, not just fear, but a hunger for dominance. For once, she wasn't the girl cowering beneath a man's fist. She was the force men feared in the dark. Tyria Moore, the silent witness. Throughout this spree, Tyria Moore remained at Eileen's side. Whether through denial or fear or dependency, Tyria asked few questions. She accepted the stolen goods, the sudden influx of cash, the erratic mood swings. In her heart, she must have known. The blood on Eileen's hands wasn't metaphorical anymore. But Tyria clung to the relationship. To leave Aileen meant losing the only stability she had, however toxic it had become. Their bond was fraught. Aileen grew paranoid, possessive, violent even toward Tyria. She accused her of cheating, of betrayal. Tyria endured it because she understood Eileen's volatility, understood how quickly love could turn to rage in her twisted world. But the cracks were deepening. Tyria wanted out. Aileen sensed it. And the fear of abandonment gnawed at her more than any police pursuit ever could. The net tightens. Police were closing in. Multiple jurisdictions began piecing together the puzzle. The missing men, the abandoned cars, the common thread of a blonde hitchhiker with a drinking problem and a violent streak. Witnesses pointed to bars like the Last Resort and biker hangouts where Aileen was known. Fingerprints on Peter Seam's car sealed her fate. Ballistic evidence tied the same .22 caliber pistol to multiple murders. A sketch of Eileen's face circulated. Tips poured in. Still, Aileen believed she was smarter than the cops. That her street smarts would keep her ahead. That the highways, her old allies, would offer her an escape. But the walls were closing fast. And Tyria was about to make a choice that would shatter everything. A shift from survival to murder. In the beginning, Eileen's justification had been survival. Richard Mallory, she claimed, had tried to rape her. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. But by the time she pulled the trigger on Walter Antonio, survival wasn't part of the equation anymore. This wasn't about fear. It was about control. About power. About revenge against a world of men who had broken her piece by piece until the only way she felt whole again was by breaking them in return. Her spiral into murder was as predictable as it was tragic. Each life taken deepened her delusion that she was serving some righteous, vengeful justice. That she was balancing the scales for every abused woman, every forgotten girl. But the truth was simpler, sadder. Aileen Wuornos had become the very monster she believed she was fighting against. The highways didn't offer freedom anymore. They offered a graveyard of victims and a trail of evidence too wide to cover. Her time was running out. Closing in. By late 1990, the Florida Task Force had her in their sights. Surveillance teams, undercover officers, wiretaps. The net wasn't just closing, it was tightening with precision. They didn't need to catch her in the act. They had enough. Enough to tie her to stolen cars, to bodies, to bullets. Enough to drag Tyria into the spotlight and squeeze her for the truth. The highways that had once promised Aileen escape now offered only one final destination: prison or death. For Aileen Wuornos, love was never tender. Love wasn't sweet. It wasn't even safe. In her world, love came wrapped in violence, betrayal, survival, and lies. Every relationship she had known since childhood, whether from family, friends, men on the streets, had carried its weight in bruises, fear, and abandonment. And then came Tyria Moore. Tyria wasn't like the others. Or at least Aileen convinced herself she wasn't. Tyria wasn't a man. Tyria didn't beat her, didn't mock her at first, and didn't look at her like a commodity. She looked at her like a person. Aileen clung to that gaze like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. But even in this supposed sanctuary of affection, Aileen's darkness would creep in. Tyria might have been the only person Aileen trusted, but she would also become the person who broke her in the end. The meeting of broken souls. Their paths crossed in Daytona Beach at a gay bar called Zodiac. Aileen was drunk. Tyria was lonely. Two women, worlds apart but equally adrift. Tyria, who had come from Ohio seeking a fresh start, worked as a hotel maid and spent her nights nursing beers in seedy bars. Aileen, always hunting, for warmth, for validation, for survival, saw something in Tyria. Vulnerability. Meet. An opening. Their connection was immediate, reckless, and fast. Within days they were inseparable. Within weeks, living together in dingy motels or the cramped trailers of transient friends. Aileen's hustling supported them both. Tyria didn't ask too many questions. Where the money came from, where the cars came from, why Aileen sometimes returned home shaking with rage and paranoia. None of it mattered. Tyria liked the safety Aileen provided. Aileen liked having someone who needed her. They called each other wife. In a world where neither had known real love, this was as close as either thought they'd get. Tyria, the quiet partner. Though Tyria wasn't pulling the trigger, she was no stranger to the signs. The stolen belongings. The wallets emptied of cash. The sudden new cars always ditched after a few days. Aileen's wild-eyed stories about bad dates, violent men, close calls on the road. Deep down Tyria knew. Maybe not the full extent. Maybe not every bullet or every scream in the woods. But she knew Aileen was running with something darker than highway hustling. Still she stayed. Out of fear. Out of loyalty. Out of love. Or maybe out of the simple fact that leaving felt impossible. Who would she turn to? Where would she go? They were bonded by desperation more than romance. Aileen needed Tyria like oxygen. Tyria needed Aileen like a paycheck. But love, even this twisted version of it, had its limits. The cracks appear. As Aileen's murders escalated, so did her paranoia. Every stranger became a threat. Every glance from a cop sent her spiraling into plans of escape. Her drinking worsened. Her violence grew unpredictable, even towards Tyria. Jealous fits turned into screaming matches. Fists through walls. Threats hurled like empty beer bottles. Tyria walked on eggshells. The affection that had once seemed pure now felt suffocating. The woman she loved wasn't just dangerous to others, she was becoming dangerous to her. Tyria feared not just discovery by the police, but what Aileen might do if she tried to leave. Still she stayed. Out of habit. Out of fear. Out of inertia. Their motel rooms became cages. Their love, a noose tightening with every murder. The turning point, Seam's car. The Pontiac Sunbird belonging to Peter Seams became the catalyst for everything that followed. When Aileen crashed the stolen car and fled the scene, she left behind more than just evidence. She left fingerprints. Hers and Tyria's. Investigators were already circling the string of murders stretching across Florida highways. Now they had a tangible link. Two women seen together, connected to a missing man and a wrecked car. Suddenly, Tyria wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was a potential accomplice. The police weren't just after Aileen anymore. They wanted them both. Love under surveillance. Law enforcement began building their trap. They watched the bars. They followed leads through biker communities, dive motels, and trailer parks. They knew Aileen wouldn't survive long without her usual haunts. They waited. And on January 9, 1991, they got their chance. Aileen was arrested at the Last Resort, a biker bar in Volusia County. Not for murder, yet. The charges were minor. Outstanding warrants, old thefts. Enough to hold her. Enough to start squeezing. But it wasn't Aileen who cracked first. It was Tyria. The betrayal. Tyria had already fled back to Ohio by the time Aileen was in cuffs. Fear gripped her. If she stayed silent, she could go down for 7 murders. She talked, she might walk free. Law enforcement offered her a deal: cooperate and they'd protect her. Wear a wire. Call Aileen. Get her to confess. Play on her love, her loyalty, her weakness for Tyria. Tyria agreed. For 3 days she called from Ohio. Coaxing. Pleading. Manipulating. Each conversation dripped with desperation. Not from Tyria, from Aileen. Aileen, locked in a cell, terrified of losing the one person she loved, told her everything. Not in cold detail, but in enough fractured admissions, enough half-confessions to seal her fate. I did what I had to do, babe. They were gonna hurt me. I just wanted us to have a better life. Tyria wept on the other end of the line. Whether those tears were real or rehearsed, only she knows. But the tapes were rolling. The police had what they needed. The arrest becomes a conviction. With Tyria's cooperation and Aileen's damning words recorded, the case against her shifted from circumstantial to airtight. Ballistics tied her gun to multiple crime scenes. Witnesses identified her. The fingerprints in Seam's car connected her. But the confessions? The confessions made everything irrefutable. On January 16, 1991, Aileen was formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. Tyria, meanwhile, disappeared from the headlines. No charges. No jail time. Just quiet immunity and a lifetime of haunted memories. To Aileen, the betrayal wasn't just legal, it was personal. The woman she thought would die beside her had chosen survival over loyalty. What Tyria meant to Aileen. For all her violence, all her rage, Aileen's heart beat only for Tyria. Friends later said Aileen spoke of her like a savior, a soulmate. In her twisted worldview, every body she left bleeding on the side of the road was a sacrifice to keep their life afloat. She stole for Tyria. Killed for Tyria. Ran for Tyria. And Tyria left her behind with a phone call and a deal. In interviews from death row, Aileen never condemned Tyria outright. She rarely mentioned her without tears. She blamed the system, the world, the men she killed, but not Tyria. Even knowing the truth, she couldn't let go of the illusion that Tyria had once loved her back. In reality, Tyria's love was rooted in survival. The same instinct that had driven Aileen to murder drove Tyria to betrayal. 2 victims, 2 survivors. In their own ways, both women were victims of abuse, poverty, and trauma. Both had learned early that love came with conditions. That safety was a fleeting, fragile thing. But where Aileen fought back with violence, Tyria fought back with silence and distance. Their story wasn't one of romance or redemption. It was one of codependency, of 2 broken people clinging to each other until survival demanded they let go. For Tyria, letting go meant freedom. For Aileen, it meant death row. Legacy of love and lies. Years after Aileen's execution, Tyria would vanish into obscurity. She gave few interviews, lived under new names, tried to scrub away the past. But the tapes remain. The court records remain. The testimony remains. Proof that in the end, Aileen Wuornos didn't fall to a bullet or a badge. She fell to the quiet, calculated betrayal of the only person she ever loved. The tragedy isn't just that Aileen killed 7 men. It's that she believed she was killing to protect something real, a love that was already dead. In the winter of 1990, the highways of Florida were no longer just asphalt veins stretching through quiet landscapes. They had become the hunting grounds of a killer. By this time, the murders had mounted, and law enforcement knew they weren't looking at random acts of violence. A pattern had emerged. Men found dead in remote locations, robbed, shot with the same small-caliber weapon, and stripped of their vehicles. The press whispered about a serial killer. The public grew uneasy. But behind the scenes, detectives were building a case. And at the center of it all, unknowingly slipping closer to capture with every stolen mile, was Aileen Wuornos. Aileen believed she was untouchable. After all, she had evaded arrest through sheer luck and street smarts. She changed cars, swapped names, vanished from towns as quickly as she appeared. But what Aileen didn't know, what no criminal ever wants to believe, is that luck runs out. The police were closing in. Their net was wide. Their patience methodical. And their secret weapon? The one person Aileen trusted most. The police began to connect the dots. Law enforcement first started seeing connections between the murders after the discovery of Peter Seam's abandoned vehicle. Though Seam's body was never recovered, the car became a vital piece of the puzzle. Inside were fingerprints, clear, unmistakable, belonging to Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore. Witnesses placed 2 women with the vehicle prior to its disappearance. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was the start of something far more sinister. As detectives retraced the victims' final days, a consistent profile emerged. Middle-aged men. Alone. Vulnerable. Picked up by a woman on the side of the road or in seedy bars known for transient drifters. The victims had little in common beyond their gender and the circumstances of their deaths. But the pattern was enough. Florida's various law enforcement agencies began working together, sharing information, connecting cases. The FBI was alerted. A task force was quietly assembled. Behind the headlines, the pressure was mounting. The media dubbed the mystery assailant the highway killer. What they didn't yet realize was that this was no male predator, no faceless man stalking women in the dark. This was Aileen Wuornos, a woman, a prostitute, a drifter, and soon to be one of America's most infamous serial killers. Building the trap. Police didn't catch Aileen through sudden discovery or brilliant deduction. They caught her the old-fashioned way: patience, surveillance, and informants. By late 1990, officers had pieced together a profile of their suspects. They knew about the two women traveling together. They knew about the wrecked car. They had fingerprints but no addresses. No fixed locations. Aileen and Tyria moved constantly, living in cheap motels, crashing with acquaintances, haunting bars where nobody asked questions and everyone had something to hide. Detectives went undercover, posing as bikers, truckers, anyone who might believably cross paths with the pair. They staked out bars like The Last Resort, where Aileen was known to drink. They watched. They waited. And eventually their patience paid off. Through a network of informants and bar regulars, police learned Aileen was still frequenting Daytona Beach. She was spiraling, drinking heavier, ranting more, flashing stolen goods like trophies. She felt emboldened. She didn't realize her face was already known to the cops watching from the corner table. But surveillance alone wouldn't be enough. They needed someone to turn on her. They needed Tyria. Tyria Moore, from lover to informant. By this point, Tyria Moore had grown increasingly paranoid. Her relationship with Aileen had deteriorated under the weight of suspicion and fear. Tyria knew too much. She suspected more. She feared both the law and Aileen's unpredictable rage. When detectives approached her with the reality of the situation, that she was potentially facing charges as an accessory to murder, she broke. Tyria was offered a deal. Cooperate fully and she could walk free. Refuse and she'd likely share Aileen's fate. The choice wasn't hard. Tyria agreed to wear a wire. She agreed to call Aileen, who was now under surveillance but not yet in custody. The goal was simple: get Aileen to incriminate herself. Play on her loyalty, her weakness for Tyria. Play the victim. Beg for reassurance. Get the confession. Over several days in January 1991, from a hotel room in Ocala with detectives listening from the next room, Tyria called Aileen repeatedly. The conversations were awkward, strained. Aileen suspected something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint it. Her instincts told her to run, but her heart told her to trust Tyria. She confessed, in fragments and slips, to the murders. Not details. Not names. But enough. I did what I had to do. They were gonna hurt me. I couldn't let them live. For detectives it was more than enough. The arrest at the last resort. On January 9, 1991, police moved in. Aileen was arrested at the Last Resort bar in Volusia County, a dive frequented by bikers, drifters, and lost souls. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had hunted strangers from behind bar stools was now trapped by the very lifestyle she believed protected her. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Aileen was cooperative, almost casual. She didn't resist. She had been through enough petty charges in her life to know the routine. She assumed this was about old warrants, thefts, maybe the stolen car. She didn't realize, at least not fully, that they had connected her to a string of murders stretching across counties. They held her on outstanding charges while building the murder case. Slowly, methodically, they gathered the evidence. Ballistics matching her .22 caliber revolver to bullets pulled from corpses. Fingerprints linking her to stolen vehicles. Witness statements placing her with the victims. And those recorded calls with Tyria, now replayed in interrogation rooms with devastating clarity. Facing the inevitable. When Aileen realized Tyria had turned, something inside her snapped. Not in anger, she didn't rage against her former lover. Instead, she seemed resigned. Betrayal wasn't new to her. It had followed her from childhood to the streets. What broke her was the finality of it. The last person she trusted had traded her freedom for her own. That was the wound she couldn't forgive, not even with time. Interrogators played good cop, bad cop. They dangled false promises of leniency, understanding, compassion. They painted pictures of Tyria crying, scared, needing to be protected. Aileen bit. Within days she confessed. 7 murders. Each, she claimed, committed in self-defense. Men tried to rape her. Men tried to kill her. She fought back. She survived. That was her narrative. But the evidence told another story. Men ambushed, shot multiple times, robbed, their bodies left to rot while Aileen pawned their belongings for beer money in motel rooms. Her version crumbled under scrutiny. The aftermath of the arrest. With her confession secured, Aileen became the property of the justice system. The media descended, hungry for every lurid detail. A female serial killer was a rarity. A lesbian drifter who targeted men? Unheard of. Headlines screamed of a lesbian prostitute highway killer. Documentaries were pitched. Reporters camped outside jails and courtrooms. Hollywood sniffed opportunity. Through it all, Aileen remained both defiant and pitiful. At times she seemed to crave the spotlight, giving interviews, crafting her persona as a misunderstood outlaw. At other times she collapsed into paranoia, convinced the police were conspiring to execute her no matter what she said. For law enforcement there was no doubt. The case was airtight. The confessions were on tape. The weapon was matched. The fingerprints undeniable. Justice by their measure would be swift and final. Tyria's silence. As Aileen faced the reality of trial and eventual execution, Tyria Moore vanished from public view. She returned to Ohio, changed her name, and lived in relative obscurity. She gave a handful of interviews over the years but mostly refused to engage with the story that had nearly swallowed her whole. Whether she felt guilt, relief, or something more complicated remains known only to her. To Aileen, Tyria's betrayal lingered like an open wound. In interviews, she oscillated between blaming herself and forgiving Tyria. "I did it for love," she said. "Everything I did for her." Whether that was true or simply another lie she told herself is impossible to say. The final realization. Sitting in a cell, stripped of her bravado, Aileen faced a truth she had long refused to accept. She wasn't a survivor anymore. She wasn't in control. She wasn't free. She was hunted, caught, and caged. The streets that once gave her power had abandoned her. The woman she killed for had sold her out. The system she hated would now decide her fate. Her trial loomed ahead. So did her place in history, not as a tragic figure, not as a survivor, but as America's most infamous female serial killer. By early 1992, Aileen Wuornos was no longer just a suspect or a prisoner awaiting her fate. She had become a media sensation. Headlines screamed of the lesbian highway killer, the monster in woman's skin, and the man-hating murderer. Beneath the lurid tabloid covers and late-night TV jokes, a real trial was preparing to unfold, one that would shape how America viewed not just Wuornos but female killers in general. The courtroom was about to witness something rare, a woman openly admitting to murder, not once but repeatedly, while oscillating between defiance and victimhood. The prosecution was confident. They had confessions, forensic evidence, and a trail of dead bodies to validate every claim. The defense, on the other hand, had almost nothing. There would be no attempt to claim innocence. The only strategy was survival, to paint Aileen as a damaged soul, a woman brutalized by life, pushed beyond the brink by trauma and violence. But how do you defend a person who, by her own words, claims she'd kill again if she had to? Preparing for trial. Aileen's court-appointed lawyers faced an uphill battle from the beginning. Public defenders, overwhelmed and underfunded, lacked the resources for a deep psychological defense. While her attorneys considered an insanity plea, Aileen herself wasn't interested in portraying herself as crazy. To her, insanity was weakness. She wanted to be seen as someone who fought back. Even her taped confessions reflected this mindset. They were going to hurt me. I had to protect myself. Over time, though, those statements became inconsistent. Sometimes she claimed self-defense, other times robbery. And in moments of unguarded honesty she admitted, "I hate men. They deserve to die." Jury selection proved difficult. The case had saturated Florida's media. Potential jurors came in already shaped by headlines and gossip. Finding 12 people who could fairly judge Wuornos seemed impossible, yet the court pressed on. Prosecutors aimed to portray Aileen not as a woman seeking justice against abusers, but as a predator, calculated, remorseless, driven by greed and bloodlust. Opening statements. The monster emerges. The prosecution's opening remarks laid bare their strategy. Strip away any sympathy for Aileen. They presented her as a manipulative hustler who lured men under the guise of prostitution, only to rob and kill them in cold blood. The murders were not spontaneous acts of self-defense but deliberate executions. They painted each victim as a man simply looking for company, tragically crossing paths with a killer. The defense countered with Aileen's history: childhood abuse, homelessness, exploitation. They argued she had been pushed into violence through years of trauma. They didn't deny the killings. Instead, they framed them within the context of survival. Each man, they claimed, had threatened her with rape or violence. Each bullet fired was a desperate act to live another day. But the courtroom was not a place for nuance. The media had already shaped Aileen into a caricature. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists captured her every scowl and smirk, and the cameras outside rolled endlessly. The evidence unfolds. One by one, the prosecution laid out their case with brutal efficiency. Ballistics experts tied her weapon, a .22 caliber pistol, to the bullets found in multiple victims. Forensic evidence placed her fingerprints on stolen vehicles and pawned items belonging to the dead. Witnesses testified seeing her with the victims shortly before their deaths. Surveillance tapes captured her pawning the belongings. Piece by piece, the narrative came together. But it wasn't just physical evidence that damned her. Aileen's own words sealed her fate. The taped phone calls with Tyria Moore, where she slipped into confessions, played before the jury. Her interviews with detectives, filled with contradictions and casual admissions of guilt, painted a picture of someone who had grown tired of lying. She just wanted to confess and get it over with, one officer later remarked. Tyria Moore, the lover-turned-informant, took the stand as well. Her testimony was guarded, rehearsed, but damning. She recounted how Aileen had returned after each killing, how she pawned the victims' items, how Tyria had grown afraid. Though Tyria maintained she never participated in the murders, the betrayal hung heavy in the air. Aileen's cold stare from the defense table never wavered as Tyria spoke. Aileen's courtroom persona. Throughout the trial, Aileen vacillated between rage and resignation. Some days she sat stone-faced, arms crossed, daring the world to look away. Other days she exploded in tirades against the judge, her own attorneys, and even the jury. "You're gonna fry me anyway, so why are we wasting time?" she screamed during one outburst. Her behavior fed the media frenzy. Journalists painted her as unstable, unhinged, violent. The public lapped it up. Yet beneath the outbursts was a woman cracking under the weight of isolation and betrayal. Gone was Tyria, gone were the enablers from the streets, gone was the illusion that she could outrun her past. Alone in a cold courtroom, Aileen faced the sum of her actions. Psychologists who examined her testified to deep-rooted mental illness, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, antisocial tendencies. But none of it mattered. The jury wasn't tasked with understanding Aileen Wuornos. They were tasked with punishing her. Her confession, owning the monstrosity. What truly cemented Aileen's image as irredeemable was her decision to confess fully. Days into the trial, she told her lawyers she wanted to plead guilty. She didn't want to sit through more testimony, more lies, more humiliation. She stood in court and admitted to murder. Not out of remorse, but because she no longer cared. "I did it. I'm glad I did it. I'd do it again," she declared. With those words, Aileen severed any remaining thread of sympathy. The courtroom fell silent, stunned not just by the confession but by the venom behind it. No tears. No apologies. Just raw, unapologetic hatred for the world that had shaped her. Her confessions made clear what investigators suspected all along. These weren't random acts of defense. They were calculated. Robbery was a motive. So was rage. But beneath it all lurked something darker, a thrill in watching life fade from a man's eyes. A hunger for revenge against a gender she saw as her lifelong oppressor. The verdict and sentence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence? Aileen showed no reaction. By then, she had already resigned herself to execution. In later interviews, she would say death was preferable to life in prison. At least she claimed it would be quick. Over the following months, additional trials followed for the other murders. Each ended the same way: guilty, death sentence. Florida's courts made it clear there would be no chance for redemption, no path to leniency. The media feasted on the story. Television specials aired. Documentaries were greenlit. Even Hollywood took notice, planting seeds for what would eventually become the Oscar-winning film Monster. Yet through it all, Aileen remained both central and peripheral, a woman transformed into a symbol, stripped of nuance, reduced to headlines. The media circus. Aileen's trial wasn't just about justice, it was spectacle. Reporters from around the world descended upon the Florida courthouses. Tabloids ran lurid stories about her sexuality, her appearance, her supposed hatred of men. Serious news outlets debated whether her upbringing excused her crimes. Talk shows dissected her psychology. Feminists argued over whether she was a product of misogyny or a perpetrator of it. In her jailhouse interviews, Aileen played into this frenzy. Some days she presented herself as a victim of circumstance, lamenting a world that had used and discarded her. Other days she leaned into the monstrous image crafted for her. "I'm the first female serial killer, so what?" she sneered. Somebody had to be. Yet behind the bravado was a woman unraveling. Her paranoia deepened. She believed the prison guards were abusing her, that the police had faked evidence, that Tyria was working with the government to ensure her death. Her rants grew more erratic. By the end, even her defenders couldn't deny her descent into madness. Final reflections. The trial of Aileen Wuornos wasn't just about one woman's crimes. It became a cultural mirror, reflecting society's discomfort with female violence, with trauma, with the idea that monsters aren't always men. In the end, the courtroom provided no answers, only a verdict. Guilty. Aileen accepted it. Not because she believed she deserved to die, but because she no longer believed in anything at all. Her story continued beyond the courtroom, through appeals and interviews, through documentaries and films. But in that moment, as the judge read her sentence, Aileen Wuornos ceased to be a person in the eyes of the law. She became history's cautionary tale. A monster perhaps, but a monster born not made. Long before Aileen Wuornos fired her first bullet, the roots of her violence were deeply embedded within her fractured mind. Understanding Wuornos is not as simple as labeling her a monster or dismissing her as insane. Her psychology is a labyrinth shaped by decades of abuse, abandonment, and rage. Though her crimes horrified the world, the forces that shaped her are disturbingly human: rejection, violence, and a desperate hunger for control in a life where she'd always had none. Psychologists, criminologists, and true crime scholars have since dissected her psyche, trying to understand what made Aileen Wuornos tick. What emerged from these analyses wasn't a portrait of madness but of methodical, cold-blooded violence born from a perfect storm of trauma and personality disorder. She wasn't legally insane. She knew exactly what she was doing. But she also wasn't simply evil in the cartoonish sense. She was the result of cumulative, compounding damage. A woman who struck back at the world the only way she had ever been taught. The roots of rage. Aileen's childhood is the first and perhaps most crucial key to unlocking her violent psychology. From the moment she was born, her life was marked by rejection. Abandoned by her teenage mother, left in the care of an abusive alcoholic grandfather, and sexually assaulted by multiple men throughout her early years, Aileen's formative experiences taught her that the world was cruel, men were dangerous, and trust was a currency she could never afford. By the age of 11, Aileen was trading sex for food, cigarettes, and attention. Not love, that was never on offer, but mere survival. Each encounter deepened her hatred for men, reinforcing her belief that they saw her as nothing more than a body to use. This hatred wasn't born in adulthood, it was incubated in childhood, fed by every assault, every cruel remark, every betrayal by those who should have protected her. Experts later diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, BPD, and antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. A lethal combination that explains much of her erratic behavior, violent outbursts, and manipulative tendencies. People with BPD often experience intense fears of abandonment, unstable relationships, and uncontrollable anger. Those with ASPD lack empathy, disregard laws and social norms, and feel little remorse for harming others. Together, these disorders created a psychological cocktail that made Aileen volatile, dangerous, and capable of murder without hesitation. Hatred of men, fuel for the fire. One cannot discuss Wuornos' psychology without acknowledging her deep-seated hatred for men. While she often claimed self-defense in her killings, the pattern of her crimes, targeting older, vulnerable men along highways, suggests something more calculated. They weren't random acts of survival. They were executions fueled by rage and resentment. Aileen projected her anger onto every man who reminded her of the predators from her past. In her mind, every potential victim wasn't just a client. He was a stand-in for the grandfather who beat her, the uncle who raped her, the countless men who treated her like trash. Killing them wasn't just about money or safety, it was revenge over and over again. Psychologists argue that this rage became pathological. While her first killing may have had elements of fear or genuine self-defense, the murders that followed showed signs of premeditation and enjoyment. She wasn't simply reacting anymore, she was asserting power. For the first time in her life, Aileen Wuornos wasn't the victim. She was in control. The gun in her hand rewrote the rules of her existence. Her hatred wasn't subtle. In interviews, she spat venom at men in general, calling them rapists, users, liars. Her disdain for the male gender wasn't hidden behind legal defenses, it was front and center, unapologetic, feral. Psychopathy and predatory behavior. Though Aileen was never officially diagnosed as a psychopath, her behavior exhibits many traits associated with psychopathy. She was manipulative, deceitful, impulsive, and capable of extreme violence without remorse. She exploited her relationship with Tyria Moore, used emotional leverage to gain sympathy, and lied freely when it suited her. Her killings followed a pattern that suggests predation, not panic. She selected victims who were isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back. She used charm, her sexuality, and the pretense of vulnerability to lure them in. Once alone, she turned on them. The consistency of her methods, gaining trust, exploiting weakness, executing violence, aligns with classic predatory behavior. What separates Wuornos from typical male serial killers, however, is motivation. While many male killers seek sexual gratification, Aileen's satisfaction came from power, control, and the erasure of those she saw as oppressors. Her murders were, in her mind, acts of reclamation. The myth of insanity. Much of the public assumed Aileen Wuornos must be insane. After all, who but a lunatic would kill strangers with such coldness? But legally and clinically, insanity requires a person to be incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Aileen knew what she was doing was illegal. She ran, hid, changed stories. She manipulated witnesses and tried to cover her tracks. These are not the actions of someone detached from reality. Her courtroom behavior, outbursts, accusations, paranoid rants, may suggest mental instability, but they stem more from personality disorders than psychosis. Borderline personality disorder explains her mood swings, fear of betrayal, and explosive anger. Antisocial traits explain her violence, lack of remorse, and manipulation. Together they created a perfect storm of dysfunction, but not insanity. Psychologists testified that Aileen was fit to stand trial. She understood the proceedings. She engaged with her lawyers, however erratically. Her later desire for execution, her proclamations of being ready to die, further underscored her grip on reality. She wasn't hearing voices. She wasn't seeing things. She simply no longer cared. Comparison to other female killers. Aileen Wuornos stands out because female serial killers are rare, and those who kill strangers even rarer. Most women who kill do so within domestic spheres. Husbands, children, lovers. Poison, not bullets. Financial motives, not rage. Wuornos broke the mold. She hunted strangers. She used a gun. She left bodies on highways, not in homes. Compared to other infamous female killers, like Belle Gunnis, who killed for insurance money, or Juana Barraza, who murdered elderly women for financial gain, Aileen's motives seem rooted more in emotion than greed. Her hatred for men born from personal trauma set her apart. She didn't kill for profit alone. She killed to assert power over those who had once held power over her. This deviation from typical female criminal patterns fascinated psychologists. She wasn't killing to protect, to provide, or even to survive, not after the first murder. She killed because she wanted to. Because it made her feel alive. Because, in her warped worldview, it was justified. The influence of Tyria Moore. One cannot dissect Aileen's psychology without considering her relationship with Tyria Moore. For Aileen, Tyria represented safety, love, and stability, all things she had been denied her entire life. Aileen's obsession with protecting Tyria fueled many of her decisions. She stole for her, killed for her, lied for her. Some psychologists argue that Aileen's violence escalated because of her desire to please Tyria, to keep her comfortable, to avoid losing her. When Tyria left, Aileen unraveled completely. The betrayal, Tyria cooperating with police, broke whatever thin thread tethered Aileen to rationality. In interviews after her arrest, Aileen often spoke of Tyria with a mix of love, hatred, and devastation. Losing her solidified Aileen's belief that the world was against her. Predator or victim? The question remains, was Aileen Wuornos a predator shaped by choice or a victim shaped by circumstance? Psychologists suggest both can be true. Her childhood created the conditions for violence. Her adulthood hardened her into someone capable of it. Her crimes were deliberate, methodical, and cold-blooded. But her psyche was damaged long before she pulled a trigger. In the end, Aileen herself embraced the role of monster. Whether out of defiance, exhaustion, or acceptance, she leaned into the label society gave her. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't ask for understanding. She wanted to die because she believed she no longer belonged among the living. Her story complicates the narrative of female violence. She wasn't insane. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't blameless. She was the sum of her traumas and the architect of her own destruction. Legacy of understanding. Today, Aileen Wuornos remains a case study in criminal psychology. Her life is dissected in classrooms, books, and documentaries as an example of how environment, trauma, and personality disorders can converge to create a killer. She forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about gender, violence, and the limits of empathy. Her psychology challenges stereotypes. Not all women kill out of love, fear, or desperation. Some kill for power, for revenge, for the simple satisfaction of control. Aileen Wuornos didn't fit into society's box, and in refusing to, she became infamous. Aileen Wuornos spent her final years confined within the stark, suffocating walls of Florida's death row. It was here, in a small, isolated cell at the Florida Department of Corrections, that her mental unraveling became impossible to ignore. While the world outside reduced her to a tabloid headline, the monster, the highway hooker killer, inside Aileen's reality grew increasingly fractured. Time stripped her down to her rawest state, and the darkness that had haunted her since childhood consumed her entirely. Death row is not designed for redemption. Inmates are left alone with their thoughts, their regrets, and in Aileen's case, their paranoia. She had been sentenced to die in January 1992. Her days became a monotonous loop of prison routines. Meals slid through metal slots, brief showers, short exercise periods under armed watch. For a woman whose life had been defined by movement, drifting highways, transient motels, escapes from danger, death row was a slow, deliberate suffocation. The decline behind bars. In these final years, Aileen's behavior grew more erratic. Guards reported bizarre outbursts, aggressive tirades, and periods of eerie calm. She accused prison staff of spitting on her food, poisoning her water, and zapping her brain with sonic pressure. Letters to supporters and court officials revealed the depth of her paranoia. She wrote about the prison being run by corrupt officials conspiring to torture her before death. It's clear that isolation only deepened her delusions. Psychologists who examined Aileen during this time noted signs of paranoia, delusional thinking, and severe mood disorders. Some believed her mental state had deteriorated past the point of rehabilitation. Others argued she had always been broken. Prison merely stripped away any remaining facade of normalcy. Despite her mounting instability, Aileen remained competent enough to make legal decisions. When offered avenues to appeal her sentence, she refused. "I want to die," she told the court. "If you leave me here, I will kill again." In her mind, she was sparing the world from another spree. Her hatred for humanity, men in particular, had calcified into something permanent. She was beyond saving and she knew it. Infamous interviews and media circus. As her execution date drew closer, Aileen granted several interviews. These moments offer the clearest window into her state of mind in her final days. The most infamous of these was with journalist Nick Broomfield, whose documentary captured Aileen's volatility in stark, unsettling clarity. In these interviews, Aileen swung wildly between moments of lucidity and delusion. One moment she would claim responsibility for her actions without remorse. The next she would weave conspiracies about police corruption, torture, and supernatural forces controlling her fate. Her words painted a portrait of a woman spiraling deeper into mental collapse. She blamed everyone but herself. Her abusive childhood, the cruel men she'd encountered, the corrupt legal system. Yet, paradoxically, she also admitted to the murders without flinching. "I hate humans," she said. "I'm so sick of hearing this 'she was abused' crap. I did what I did and I'm ready to go." Her interviews became a grotesque form of entertainment for the public. The media framed her as both villain and victim, monster and martyr. In these final days, Aileen Wuornos ceased to be a person in the eyes of the world. She became a cautionary tale, a freak show spectacle wrapped in sensational headlines. Paranoia takes over. Aileen's paranoia intensified as her execution approached. She accused prison staff of tormenting her at night, claimed that cameras watched her even in the shower, and insisted that the government was conspiring to frame her for murders she hadn't committed. "They're using me for science," she once ranted. "Experimenting on me like I'm a rat in a lab." These delusions echoed the same mistrust that had governed her actions outside prison walls. Betrayal, abandonment, and exploitation had followed her from childhood into adulthood, and now into the confines of death row. Her mind, already fragile, simply couldn't distinguish reality from conspiracy any longer. Her defense attorneys raised concerns about her mental fitness, but Aileen was adamant. "I am sane," she said. "I am fine. I just hate this world." The court agreed. She remained scheduled for execution. Final days. In the days leading up to October 9, 2002, Aileen was moved to the Death Watch cell, a grim holding area for those counting down their final hours. She refused a special last meal, opting instead for a simple cup of coffee. When asked about her impending death, she showed no fear, no remorse, only a disturbing calmness. Those who visited her reported a woman at peace with her fate, if not entirely stable. She believed she would return as an alien after death, that a spaceship awaited her beyond this life to take her home. Whether this was genuine belief or a final act of defiance is impossible to say. Her final legal statements were devoid of pleas for mercy. She told the court she was glad it would soon be over. "I'll be back," she said cryptically, hinting at her bizarre belief in reincarnation or extraterrestrial existence. Execution and last words. On the morning of October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was led to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Strapped to the gurney, she remained stoic. Witnesses reported no tears, no final struggle. Her last words were chilling in their casual cruelty, delivered with a half-smile. "I just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." With that, the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, Aileen Wuornos was dead. She was 46 years old. Her cremated remains were sent to Michigan and scattered by a childhood friend. No public funeral. No mourners lining the streets. In death as in life, Aileen Wuornos remained alone. The end of the road. In the end, death row did not break Aileen Wuornos. If anything, it crystallized her into the person she had always been becoming. Paranoid, furious, and utterly disconnected from the world around her. Her story ended not with a scream, but with a cryptic promise to return. For many, her death was justice served. For others, it was the final tragedy of a woman born into darkness who never stood a chance at light. Her story remains a haunting reminder of how monsters aren't born fully formed. Sometimes they're shaped, piece by piece, scar by scar, until there's nothing human left at all. The story of Aileen Wuornos did not end with her death. If anything, her execution sealed her legacy as one of the most infamous female serial killers in history. Her face, her story, her crimes, they remain carved into the collective memory of true crime enthusiasts, psychologists, and criminologists alike. In life, Aileen terrified the public with her violence. In death, she became a haunting symbol of female rage, trauma, and the terrifying capacity for brutality hidden behind a woman's smile. Her case continues to provoke uncomfortable questions about gender and violence. Society is conditioned to view killers as men. When a woman commits murder, especially multiple murders, the world struggles to understand. Aileen Wuornos forced the world to confront this discomfort head-on. She wasn't the quiet poisoner, the manipulative black widow often associated with female killers. She was violent, impulsive, unapologetic. She hunted men the way society expected only men to hunt women. In this, she shattered stereotypes and became a cautionary tale about overlooking the darkness in places we least expect. The face of female rage. Psychologists, journalists, and filmmakers have returned to Aileen's story time and again, trying to dissect what made her who she was. Was she a monster from birth? Or a woman destroyed by a lifetime of cruelty, abandonment, and abuse? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Aileen's childhood was a blueprint for disaster. Sexual abuse, abandonment, homelessness, prostitution. These were the foundations on which her rage was built. Her killings weren't random. They were a twisted form of justice in her own mind, a warped revenge against a world of men who had used and discarded her. Each murder was both an act of violence and a scream into the void, "I will not be a victim again." This blend of victimhood and aggression is what makes her story so difficult to categorize. Aileen Wuornos blurred the line between predator and prey. Her legacy has been immortalized in film, most notably in Monster, 2003, where Charlize Theron's Oscar-winning portrayal humanized her without excusing her crimes. Documentaries, books, and academic studies continue to analyze her life, often using her as a case study for the extremes of trauma-induced violence. Yet, even with all this examination, Aileen remains something of an enigma. Her rage was loud, her motives messy, her story both horrifying and tragic. A warning hidden in plain sight. Beyond the headlines and Hollywood adaptations, Aileen Wuornos represents something deeper. A warning about the unseen consequences of neglect, abuse, and unchecked mental illness. She wasn't born a monster. She was shaped into one by years of abandonment, exploitation, and violence. Her story is a brutal reminder that society often creates the very nightmares it fears most. But there's another layer to her legacy: the danger of trust. Aileen preyed on kindness. She posed as a woman in need, a flat tire, a ride, a helping hand, and lured men into a deadly trap. In doing so, she flipped the script on the typical predator-prey dynamic. For once, it wasn't the woman who had to fear the man on the deserted highway. It was the man who should have been afraid. This inversion unsettles us even today. It speaks to a deeper fear, that danger doesn't always come in the expected form. Sometimes it wears a woman's face. Sometimes it asks for help. Why she still haunts us. Aileen's crimes weren't the most gruesome in history. Her body count wasn't the highest. Yet, her story sticks with us because it defies easy explanation. She wasn't purely evil, nor was she purely a victim. She was both. A mirror held up to the worst parts of humanity: cruelty, desperation, rage, and the need for control. Her legacy endures because she forces us to ask hard questions. How many Aileens are out there now, shaped by trauma, simmering with rage, waiting to explode? How many people do we pass by each day who wear a mask of civility over a heart full of darkness? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Aileen Wuornos reminds us that evil doesn't always look how we expect. The final lesson. In the years since her execution, Aileen has become a cultural touchstone in discussions of crime, gender, and psychology. Some see her as a monster. Others as a victim of her circumstances. Most recognize she was both. Her story lingers because it touches on universal fears: the betrayal of trust, the randomness of violence, the fragility of sanity. Ultimately, Aileen Wuornos' life serves as a dark parable about the cost of turning a blind eye to suffering. About what happens when society fails its most vulnerable until they become its most dangerous. About how monsters aren't always born. Sometimes they're made. Sometimes they make themselves. Her final legacy may be this: a cautionary tale that evil doesn't always come with fangs or claws. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it cries. Sometimes it asks for a ride home. And sometimes it kills.